Biblical scholars have argued for years about the location of these holy sites. Now, one man says he might have found them. Take a look.
Moses' journey in Exodus officially began on a sacred mountain. A mountain we've been told is located in Egypt. But what if that was a lie?
I'm at the base of a mountain believed to be the location of the true Mount Sinai, where Moses received the 10 Commandments from God.
Recently, new scanning technology was used to examine this mountain, and the results reopened a debate many thought was settled forever. Because if this mountain isn't Sinai, then the real question is simple. How did we all agree on the wrong one? The mountain everyone was taught about. Most people never question where Mount Sinai is supposed to be. It is taught as a settled fact, passed along the same way names and dates are passed along. And once something is repeated enough times, it stops sounding like a claim and starts sounding like history. Mount Sinai, people say, is in Egypt, and the mountain is called Jebel Musa. There is an old monastery at the bottom, and that seems to confirm everything. St. Catherine's Monastery has been standing there for more than 1,000 years.
Tucked into the base of an imposing mountain. In Arabic, it's called Jebel Musa.
That alone carries a lot of weight. After all, old buildings tend to do that. They make the story around them sound older and more certain than it might actually be. Pilgrims visit the site every year, going there out of faith, curiosity, or just because it is simply part of the story they were taught. They climb the mountain early in the morning, often in the dark, using steps that have been there for centuries. Many believe they are walking where Moses once walked. But none of that explains how Jebel Musa became Mount Sinai in the first place. The truth is, the location was not chosen because someone proved it with careful study of the land. It was chosen because of belief and authority. In the 4th century, Christianity had just become legal in the Roman Empire. Worship moved out of hiding, so public faith needed public places. People wanted real locations connected to sacred stories, not just words written on a page. Around that time, monks settled near Jebel Musa in the Sinai Peninsula. They believed the mountain was holy, and that belief slowly began to spread. A few centuries later, Emperor Justinian ordered a large fortified monastery to be built at the base of the mountain. Once an emperor backed the site, the decision stopped being questioned. The monastery had guards, walls, and protection. And from that moment on, Jebel Musa was treated as Mount Sinai. Over time, the idea became somewhat hardened. Maps were drawn with the name fixed in place. Pilgrims wrote accounts that repeated the claim, and even churches taught it as fact. Generation after generation grew up hearing the same thing. And after long enough, the location looked like historical truth. But something that gets rarely mentioned is that the people who made that choice did not have the tools we have today. They were not testing rock samples or studying how ancient people moved across the land. They were not comparing geography to old travel routes in detail. They worked with belief and what made sense to them at the time. Much later, when scholars began reading the ancient texts more closely and comparing them to the land itself, questions started to come up. The route described in the story did not point clearly to Egypt. The land around Jebel Musa raised problems that tradition simply could not answer. Once people began paying attention to those details, it raised one very important question. What if they picked the wrong mountain? What the biblical text actually says, not what we assume. Before looking at maps or mountains, there is one place we have to start, and that's the text itself. That is, the words written in Exodus. Many people assume the Bible clearly points to the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. It does not. In fact, it never names a modern country at all. What it gives instead are clues, routes, place names, and distances. And when you read those clues closely, they raise problems that are hard to ignore. After crossing the Red Sea, the Israelites begin a journey through the wilderness. The text says they traveled toward a place called Midian. This detail matters more than most people realize because Midian was not a vague idea. It was a known region in the ancient world. It appears in other parts of the Bible and in outside records. And it was not in Egypt. Midian was east of the Gulf of Aqaba, in what is today northern Arabia. This is where Moses fled years earlier after leaving Egypt. This is where he lived for decades, where he married, and where his father-in-law was a priest. Moses knew this land well. Exodus also tells us that the mountain of God was in this same region. It does not say the Israelites wandered back toward Egypt. It says they moved forward, deeper into the wilderness, toward Midian. That path leads away from the Sinai Peninsula, not into it. There are also the physical details we must take into consideration. You see, when God descended on the mountain, the text describes fire, smoke, and violent shaking. Smoke rose like that of a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled. This was not a calm or serene scene. It can only be described best as intense and overwhelming. The text also says that boundaries were set. The people were warned not to touch the mountain. Stones were placed to mark the limit, and anyone who crossed it would die. This tells us the event took place in an open area where a large group could gather, camp, and be kept at a distance. Another detail you might also notice when you read Exodus is the timing of everything. The Israelites stayed near the mountain for many months, which means it wasn't a short visit at all. The place had to support a long stay for a large group and their animals. Now, none of this proves a location on its own. But what it does is narrow the field. It rules some places out. And when those clues are followed without tradition guiding the hand, they pull the story in a clear direction. Not toward Egypt, but toward Midian. The geography problem no one likes to talk about. Once the biblical clues are laid out, the next step should be simple. You check the land to see if the ground matches the story. Unfortunately, this is where things start to fall apart, and why many people prefer not to go here at all. Let us start with Jebel Musa in Egypt. This mountain is deep inside the Sinai Peninsula, surrounded by other mountains of the same kind. The rock is granite, solid, stable, and very old. These are quite important points to note, because granite does not burn, melt easily, nor does it show signs of extreme heat unless something truly massive happens. Yet Exodus describes a mountain covered in fire and smoke. Remember that Exodus did not describe this phenomenon as if it were symbolic. The fact is, it was a real event witnessed by thousands of people. The mountain shook, smoke rose thick and heavy, and everyone who saw it was described to have been afraid. But then, geologists have studied Jebel Musa for years, and there is no sign of heat damage or past volcanic or thermal activity. Nothing that lines up with the story being told. Supporters of the site often respond by saying the fire was only spiritual. But the text does not say that at all. It describes physical effects that people could see and feel. And let's not forget the travel route. After leaving Egypt, the Israelites cross the Red Sea and move into the wilderness. From there, the text points them toward Midian. And to reach Midian, the group would need to move east of the Gulf of Aqaba. That route does not take you deeper into the Sinai Peninsula, out of it. Yet the traditional site asks us to believe the group somehow turned back west and then south, without the text ever saying so. Supporters of Jebel Musa often rely on habit rather than maps. The location feels right because it has always been there. But when ancient travel paths are studied, well, the match becomes weak, because in addition to everything else, there is also the size issue. Exodus describes a massive gathering at the base of the mountain. The people camped, waited, moved back when told, and stayed for many months. This would require wide-open land with room for people and animals. Much of the area around Jebel Musa is narrow, rocky, and steep, which means that large camps would struggle to fit there for long periods. Plus, a place that can hold that many people for that long has to have access to water. The Sinai Peninsula is harsh. Yes, springs exist, but many are small and seasonal. The text suggests repeated access to water during the stay, not constant crisis. So, if the location does not match the text, why has it stayed in place for so long? Jabal al-Lawz and the Saudi Arabia hypothesis. Once Egypt no longer fits the story well, attention naturally shifts elsewhere. When the locations mentioned in Exodus are followed carefully, one mountain in northwestern Saudi Arabia keeps appearing in the discussion. That mountain is Jabal al-Lawz. Jabal al-Lawz is located near the Gulf of Aqaba in a region long identified with ancient Midian. For many years, it was not considered in debates about Mount Sinai, mainly because it was outside the areas traditionally linked to biblical history. It was not part of church tradition, and for decades, it was difficult for researchers to access. Interest in Jabal al-Lawz grew when scholars began comparing the biblical route with real geography rather than inherited assumptions. When the journey after the Red Sea crossing is traced step by step, the path moves east, not back into Egypt. When that route is placed on a map, it points toward northwest Arabia, rather than the Sinai Peninsula. Midian itself is not in doubt since ancient records describe it as a real place, and archaeology has found clear signs of Midianite life in this part of Arabia. This matches the setting given in Exodus. The text does not say the mountain of God was in Egypt. It places it in or near Midian. Jabal al-Lawz also fits the needs described in the story. The land around it opens into wide areas that could hold a large group for a long time. This is different from narrow and steep land, where space is limited. The region is also located along known old travel paths, which would make it easier for large groups with animals to move through. There is also a long-standing local tradition linking this mountain to Moses. Bedouin communities in the area have associated the mountain with him for generations. While oral tradition alone cannot confirm events from the distant past, it can preserve geographic memory, especially in regions where people have lived close to the land for long periods of time. Even with these points, the idea that Jabal al-Lawz could be Mount Sinai stayed outside academic discussion. For one, there was no access to the place. For many years, this part of Saudi Arabia was closed to outside study, so researchers could not carry out surveys or collect proper data. There's also the fact that people resisted the very idea that what they have known as truth for years was incorrect. Jebel Musa in Egypt had been accepted for centuries. Maps and books were built around it, so changing the location of Mount Sinai would mean questioning long-held views, and many scholars were not eager to do that. Why the area was restricted for so long. For a long time, the land around Jabal al-Lawz was not easy to reach, and that single fact influenced everything that followed. When access to a place is limited, serious study is almost impossible to carry out, and questions remain unanswered. When this happens, people try to guess what they think might be the truth, and that is exactly what happened here. Saudi Arabia spent much of the 20th century keeping tight control over large parts of its territory, especially areas close to its borders. The northwest region falls into that category. It sits near Jordan and the Gulf of Aqaba, both of which have long been sensitive areas for movement and security. Because of this, travel in the region was carefully managed, and entry was most times restricted without much explanation. Also, certain parts of the Northwest were linked to military training and monitoring activities. When land is connected to defense, it usually becomes closed by default. This is not unique to Saudi Arabia, of course. Many countries restrict access to areas used by the military, even when there is no active conflict. Once a place is marked off that way, outside research becomes difficult, regardless of its purpose. At the same time, the country was cautious about archaeology. For many years, Saudi authorities were concerned about foreign teams removing objects, damaging sites, or changing local history to fit outside ideas. Due to this, permits for archaeological work were limited, and many requests were turned down. As a result, places like Jabal al-Lawz remained largely unstudied in a formal way. This, as one would expect, created a serious problem. You see, without direct access, researchers could not carry out surveys or collect reliable data. That meant there were no reports or published findings, and nothing solid for scholars to debate. Without evidence, most academics had no choice but to remain silent about the subject. Over time, the silence itself became part of the issue. As often happens, the lack of clear information led to extremes. As we've seen happen with several other debates or topics, some people filled the gap with claims that went far beyond the available evidence. There were even those who dismissed the entire subject as fantasy, not because it had been proven wrong, but because no proper work had been done. Unfortunately, no one could say which side was right or wrong because no one had gotten the opportunity to look close enough at the mountain. But things started to change toward the end of the 2010s. Saudi Arabia started to open parts of the country to visitors and researchers. Archaeology became something to protect and study, rather than avoid. International teams were invited to examine ancient towns, rock art, and old trade routes across the kingdom. And just like that, the idea of controlled research slowly replaced the fear of loss. Even then, places like Jabal al-Lawz remained difficult to study on foot. Getting permission still took time, and large digs were unlikely. But by that point, the situation had changed in another important way. Technology no longer required digging to learn what lay below the ground. New tools made it possible to collect information from above, using methods already common in mapping and security work. This reduced the need for physical entry and lowered the risks tied to excavation. Because of this, research could finally move forward without disturbing the land or breaking any rules. Data could be gathered carefully, without teams on the ground or equipment being hauled across the desert. Surface-level archaeology around Jabal al-Lawz. Before any talk of what might be underground, it is worth looking at what has already been seen above ground around Jabal al-Lawz. This is where many of the strongest claims are made, and also where the most confusion often begins. Some features have been recorded by visitors and researchers, while others are still debated, misunderstood, or overstated. One of the most discussed features is the dark rock found near the top of the mountain. Photos and videos show stones that appear darker than those on nearby peaks. This has sometimes been described as evidence of intense heat, while other times it's been said to be the result of natural weathering, mineral content, or long exposure to the elements. Without careful testing and published studies, this feature cannot be linked with certainty to the events described in Exodus. What can be said is that the darker rock is unusual in that area, and it has raised questions that remain open. Another feature often mentioned is a large split rock near the base of the mountain. The stone appears cracked into two main sections, with signs of erosion along the split. Some see this as matching the story of water flowing from a rock in the wilderness. Others point out that rocks can split naturally due to stress, heat changes, internal weakness, and many other possibilities. In a dry region, erosion patterns can also be misleading. Right now, this feature can only be described as interesting, not proven. There are also stone arrangements that have been found in the area. Some consist of stacked rocks laid out in rough shapes. Those who support Jabal al-Lawz being Moses' mountain suggest these could be remains of altars or boundary markers, while those that disagree argue they may be animal pens, temporary shelters, or later constructions unrelated to the Exodus period. Similar stone features appear across much of Arabia and date to many different times, which makes firm dating difficult without excavation. One thing we must understand is that surface-level archaeology has its limits. Objects on the surface are exposed to weather, movement, reuse, and other elements. The fact is, stones can be moved and sites can be altered. Even meanings can change over time. This makes surface finds useful for raising questions, but weak for drawing strong conclusions on their own. This is the reason why professional archaeologists are usually careful. They look for patterns, context, and layers, not single objects. Without controlled study, surface features remain suggestive rather than decisive. Around Jabal al-Lawz, what exists is a collection of features that some believe line up with the biblical story and others believe can be explained in ordinary ways. At present, neither side has enough evidence to settle the debate. What these surface findings do show is that the area was definitely used by people in the past. It wasn't empty land, and human activity obviously took place there over long periods of time. That alone makes it worthy of careful study. But surface clues can only take the story so far. To go further, researchers had to look beyond what the eye could see. Looking beyond. What can be seen? After looking at what exists on the surface, a simple question starts to form. If anything important once existed here, would it still be visible today? After thousands of years of wind, erosion, and human movement, would it really be sitting out in the open waiting to be photographed? Probably not. Surface evidence has limits. Stones get moved, and what once stood in the open often ends up buried or broken apart over time. So, if something meaningful was built or stored near a mountain like this, it would make sense for it to be below ground by now. That idea alone changes how you think about the place. For a long time, there was no practical way to follow that idea. Digging was not allowed, and walking the land freely was restricted. So even if people suspected there was more beneath the surface, there was nothing they could do about it. The conversation stayed stuck at what could be seen with the eye. But then the question became, if digging is off the table, is there any way to look without digging? Surely the answer was yes, because modern survey tools could look below the surface and give answers to questions long being asked. But these tools were never designed to uncover religious sites at first. They were built for very ordinary reasons, like when builders needed to know what was under the ground before laying roads and when engineers needed to avoid hidden hazards. But the same tools later found their way into archaeology. Drones are one such tool that were used for these processes, but not in the way many people assume. A drone does not magically see through rock. What it does is allow equipment to move across large or difficult areas and collect detailed information without anyone stepping foot there. It helps with mapping, patterns, and surface details that can hint at what might be underneath. Other tools go a step further. Ground-penetrating radar sends signals into the ground and reads how they return. When the signal behaves differently in one spot, it suggests the ground there is not the same as the ground around it. It does not tell you what that difference is. It only tells you that something is different. Even magnetic surveys do something similar by reading changes in the natural magnetic field of the ground. Satellite images help by showing large-scale features such as old paths or disturbed land that are easy to miss from close range. Although none of these tools provide answers on their own, they do help people stop guessing blindly and start asking better questions. Nomadic camps and the myth of missing evidence. One of the strongest arguments used against the Exodus story is the lack of visible remains. The thinking goes like this. If a very large group stayed near a mountain for months, then traces should be obvious. If nothing clear can be found today, then the event must never have happened. On the surface, that logic sounds fair. But it rests on an assumption that does not hold up. It assumes that all people in the past lived in ways that leave behind strong and lasting traces. That is true for cities built with stone and brick, but not true for groups that moved often and built very little. The Israelites described in Exodus did not live in houses. They lived in tents, and tents do not leave walls or floors. The materials used to make them, such as cloth, rope, leather, and wood, decay quickly. In dry regions, they can vanish entirely. After a short time, there is nothing left to mark where a tent once stood. Daily life also leaves fewer marks than many people expect. Food was simple and prepared in small fires. These fires were not deep pits lined with stone. They were shallow and temporary. Wind spreads ash and rain washes it away. Stones used for cooking get reused or scattered. Over long periods of time, even trained researchers struggle to find traces of such activity. The same applies to everyday objects. Nomadic groups did not carry large amounts of pottery. Heavy items break easily and slow down movement. When something did break, the pieces were left behind as the group moved on. Over time, those fragments spread across wide areas and mix with material from many different periods. Once that happens, tying them to one moment in history becomes extremely difficult. Time also works against preservation. The events described in Exodus are placed more than 3,000 years in the past. Since then, the region has seen strong winds, sudden floods, moving sand, and repeated human movement. These forces do not protect light remains. They break them down, bury them, or erase them completely. This is why archaeologists are careful when judging absence. In many known cases, camps used only a few hundred years ago leave little to nothing behind. Researchers often rely on faint soil changes or subtle disturbances rather than objects you can point to easily. Expecting clearer signs from a much older camp sets an unrealistic standard. So, the lack of obvious remains does not mean the story failed to leave evidence. It means the type of life described was never meant to leave strong traces in the first place. And when a way of life leaves little behind in the ground, it does not mean it left nothing behind at all. Sometimes, what lasts is not found in objects, but in memory. Sacred memory, oral tradition, and the Midianites. There is one part of this story that does not come from objects found in the ground, but comes from people, from what they remembered and passed down by speaking, long before books or records were common. In many ancient societies, history was told using stories. Parents told children about places they walked past every day. Elders explained why a mountain or a well was important. These stories were not told once, but were repeated over and over, most times tied to daily life. When memory is linked to the land people live on, it tends to last. This was common in Arabia. Groups lived in the same regions for long periods, moving through familiar paths and using the same landmarks. Mountains helped people travel, mark territory, and even explain past events. When something important happens at a place, it is nearly impossible for that place to lose its meaning easily. The Midianites were one of these groups. Archaeology shows they were active across northwestern Arabia. They traded and moved through wide areas of land for years and years. They knew the terrain well and gave names to places that stood out to them. Those names were used in stories, and those stories were passed on for generations. The Bible places Moses among the Midianites for many years before the Exodus. He lived with them, worked with them, and started a family there. Living that way means sharing daily life and shared knowledge. It also means learning which places were important to the people around you. This kind of explains a small but important detail in Exodus. When Moses sees the burning bush, he is told that the ground he is standing on is already holy. The text does not say it becomes holy at that moment. It is described as holy before Moses arrives. That suggests the place already had meaning before the Israelites came. Local traditions around Jabal al-Lawz fit this idea. Families living near the mountain have long connected it with Moses. These stories did not come from churches or outside teachers, but were passed down within the community through everyday speech. The mountain was not picked later because it simply fit, but because it was remembered by the descendants of the people who actually lived on that land. And if that is the case, can we decisively say that it proves that Jabal al-Lawz is Mount Sinai? Or are we more uncomfortable with the idea that we might have been pointing at the wrong mountain for centuries? Leave your answers in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching. And if you enjoy this video, please click on the next one on your screen.